Hi, Ann.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks.
I should say that I am Bob Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and you are Ann Marlowe almost of Afghanistan. You've certainly been there enough. When I discovered this about you, and that you've written about it a lot, I decided it would be interesting to talk to you because I'm still kind of trying to make up my mind on Afghanistan, and I suffer from a shortage of data. And you've been there a lot. You've written about it for the Weekly Standard, Wall Street Journal opinion section, Forbes, and so on, New York Post. Now, for starters, one might infer from those data points that you are a conservative. Is that a label you accept, or do you think you're more complex than that?
Well, like everyone, I think I'm more complex than that. I'd say I'm a libertarian economically, even a liberal on social issues, and a neocon on foreign policy issues, which would explain a lot of how I feel about Afghanistan. But I would say that whether you're a realist, a neocon, or even an isolationist, you have to come to certain conclusions about Afghanistan. And the thing that nobody talks about is population growth. Afghanistan has one of the world's youngest and fastest growing populations. They're going to have 50 million people by 2025 and 82 million people by 2050.
How many do they have now?
No one really knows. They have somewhere between 20 and 30 million. There hasn't been a census taken in 40 years.
And they're very young.
Very young. The world's youngest population. Actually, I think it may tie with a couple of African countries, but again, very hard to say. I think the UN has said it has the world's highest percentage of kids in the 10 to 14-year-old age group.
Ooh. And
they will be reproducing in another...
You know what alarms me about that is that within a few years, that means there will be a lot of males in insurgency joining age, in big cohort coming up there.
You're absolutely right. That's the key point. We cannot leave Afghanistan in a position where it's going to have a huge population of illiterate, unemployed young men who've been nourished on, jihadi messages.
Okay. I think I would agree that that's a bad thing. I'm not sure how you best avoid it. I'm agnostic on that right now. But why don't you...
Well, I've got some ideas.
I'll bet you do. We're going to get to those. First, I'm curious as to how you... came to go to Afghanistan really a number of times. Your website describes you as both a business person and a writer. Now, is the business part unrelated to the Afghanistan visiting, or did that initially get you interested in that region, or what?
Unrelated.
Unrelated, okay.
I've always been interested in Central Asia, and I went on a trip to Central Asia in 1999, sort of circled all around Afghanistan, wasn't able to visit Afghanistan. But when the chance became available in 2002, I went as soon as I could, which was May 2002. And I kind of fell in love with the country and with the possibilities that it represented. I mean, I think one of the aspects of Afghanistan that grabs a lot of foreign visitors is that one person can really make a difference. One person can report things that have not been reported. One person can start a business that's never been started. One person provide advice that's never been given. It's small and intimate enough in that way. So that was very intriguing to me, as a journalist.
Okay. And I gather you're not entirely, although you describe yourself as a neocon on foreign policy, you're not entirely singing with the choir right now because although you do favor, an assertive counterinsurgency strategy, You are not convinced that we need the big addition of troops that General McChrystal is asking for?
That's right. I think neither do we need the large addition of troops, nor do we need the large numbers for the Afghan National Security Forces, the police and the army that he's been calling for. I think that, he has some wise men advising him. I also believe he has some fools advising him.
I don't suppose you want to name names, do you?
I'll do that a little later, but let me first say that I think he and people in the Army, understandably, want to cover their asses and want to make sure that they have enough troops so that if things begin to go wildly wrong, no one can say they were undermanned.
Right.
But I don't think that's the way to win. What I saw when I was in Afghanistan on my first embed 3 years ago was a very successful counterinsurgency effort beginning in RC East, Regional Command East, which is 6 provinces on the Pakistan border, particularly in Khost. I was in Khost, in Ghazni, in Nangarhar, in Laghman, on that embed, and Khost was kind of the spearhead for a new American policy of getting troops off the FOBs, in that case FOB Salerno, and into the districts. Districts are like American counties, basically. They usually have 100 to 130,000 Afghans. The idea was to build really small bases. I mean, we're talking about bases that are the size of an American public school. Staff them with 30, 40 American maneuver troops who will mentor the Afghan National Security Forces within the same compound and provide security for what they call the district governor, who would be like our county executive. They have a local court there. They have, local business offices, basically what you would have at a town hall in the United States. Sometimes there's also a mosque. Sometimes there's a clinic. Other aspects of government services. And that worked pretty well. I mean, 200 American maneuver troops at that point were securing a province of 1 million people. That's the size of the Bay Area. And a couple of years later, security had deteriorated with more troops. The reason being that the 101st Airborne, I think, forgot about the whole point of counterinsurgency, which is concentrating your efforts on providing security to the population, not chasing insurgents. If you provide security to the population and give them a good reason to be loyal to their elected government, you won't have a problem with the insurgency. The insurgency won't get the food, the supplies, the secrecy, the collaboration, the cooperation that they get from the population now. The 101st Airborne was doing air assaults up in remote mountainous areas where very, very few people live to try to, quote, capture some Taliban or destroy their camps. But, of course, by the time you do a helicopter assault on a remote mountain stronghold in Afghanistan, everyone knows you're coming from miles away. It's not an area where there's a lot of air traffic. And the Taliban had long since fled. I would ask the soldiers, well, did you see any Taliban? Did you get in any, make contact, get in any engagements? And the answer was inevitably no. We captured some sleeping bags. So that was pointless. And having 800 men doing that is just as pointless as having 200 men.
Well, was it counterproductive beyond being pointless? I mean, there was actual damage being done by such a large footprint, or?
No, it had nothing to do with the footprint. It had to do with what they were doing.
It was just a waste.
In other words, it's an enormous waste of time to schlep a bunch of highly armed, highly trained men up a mountaintop where everyone knows they're coming and there's going to be no one to fight them. The Taliban aren't fools. They're not going to just remain in their camp to get slaughtered when someone does an air assault on them. They're going to disperse, leave their pitiful equipment behind, and go hide in some caves or in somebody's house or whatever. And it's going to take a week for the Americans to try to track them down, because that's just the reality of the terrain and the way it's inhabited in the area.
So why did the security situation get actually worse, though? I got distracted for a second by trying to stifle a sneeze, I should say, so I may have lapsed and missed a key point. But, I mean, why, if this was just wasteful, I would expect things to get no worse. It's just costing us a lot of money for them to not get better. What was it that we were doing that caused the security situation to actually deteriorate?
Well, two things. One, the American Army there was actually ignoring the development projects which had been set in motion by the PRT, the Provincial Reconstruction Team. under the previous command, basically a lot of public works projects have been going on all through RC East, a tremendous amount of road and school building, some rural electrification, some small hydro projects for electricity from water, a lot of dams and culverts to prevent farmers' crops from getting flooded. There's actually now also a new agricultural PRT just to advise farmers, because most people there are farmers. And basically, they were neglecting visiting those projects or even making sure that they were going forward. There were areas where, insurgents had disrupted a road building project, and the Americans had been so busy up in the mountains that they weren't able to attend to that and provide the security for the road to go forward. And roads are really development magic and counterinsurgency magic. They not only do the obvious thing of allowing people to take their crops to market more quickly, to engage in economic activity, they also reduce dust, they increase public health, and new businesses spring up along roads. It's really quite amazing when you look at the statistics, which the American Army, keeps for various provinces, and which are available in other countries, where you don't have a military presence. As soon as you build a road, you get a gas station, you get a hotel, you get a snack shop, you get farmers, selling apples by the side of the road.
So could you put it this way? I mean, counterinsurgency strategy consists of, among other things, A, keeping the civilian population on your side, giving them reasons to like you and not welcome insurgents, and B, killing bad guys when you can, especially the so-called irreconcilables. And it sounds like very early in the war, even before counterinsurgency proper had become official kind of doctrine the way it is now, we were in fact doing a good version of the civilian side of that with these development projects. But then when the focus seems to have shifted to killing the bad guys, that turned out to be done in a way that was A, ineffectual, and B, led us to lose sight of the civilian side of the counterinsurgency strategy.
Well, yes and no. First of all, if you're referring to civilian casualties,
not so much. I'm just talking about the development projects that would have kept them on our side. Those we did embark on early, but then neglected. You're saying?
Well, no. We didn't do anything in RC East really until 2005, 2006. It accelerated in 2007. It's continued. It has continued. I mean, make no mistake, it has continued. And what I'm talking about here are details. It's not as if they stopped building schools or roads. But the focus on the bad guys has to be a selective one and a smart one. It's not about going up a mountain where nobody lives.
Right.
What it is about is killing higher value targets. No one objects to that. I mean, I think everyone thinks that's a good idea, even the Afghans. Sometimes that can be accomplished through soft power. I actually was present when a medium to high value target was brought in Khost, completely by accident. A mullah who was suspected in blowing up girls' schools had been invited to a luncheon that I was present at as a reporter, and no one was aware for, the first 20 minutes, except the outgoing maneuver commander, Colonel Scott Custer from the 82nd Airborne, that this was the wanted man. And he signaled to his replacement from the 101st Airborne to come out for, have a word with him. I saw them do that. I didn't think anything of it. They came back in. Next thing I knew they were going out with the mullah. And I thought, this is a little weird. What's happening here? Because we'd been eating lunch. And lo and behold, they'd given a call to Special Forces to come and send some Humvees to take the good mullah away, which happened. And no shots were fired, no civilians were killed, but the goal was accomplished. And it was a adroit bit of trickery on the part of the governor and the local sub-governor.
Okay, now, am I correct in thinking that your view is that the way to do effective counterinsurgency now without a big troop increase consists partly in moving the focus from rural areas. I think you think we've got too many troops in rural areas who could be deployed in higher population density areas. Is that right?
Well, in part, we have too many Afghan police in rural areas where they're just getting killed.
Oh, okay.
And they're not able to provide any security even to themselves. They're getting killed at the rate of 100 a month in the rural areas in what we call the districts. Last year, it's a little better this year, not much better, maybe about 90 a month. And that's after a massively expensive American-led training program called Focused District Development, of which the aim was to weed out the bad cops, replace them with good cops, train all the cops, and give them the survival skills to keep them alive. But that's not really possible. They don't have the support of a lot of the local population. You know, when I talk about a rural area, I'm usually talking about an ethnically homogeneous area in the, 100% Pashtun, where all the are for one tribe. They bring in cops who are not from that tribe, even if they're from 10 miles away. They're perceived as outsiders, and nobody's going to defend them. The only people who get under the tribal security umbrella are fellow members of the tribe. So I think we should be working with that. We should be using the local system that works more or less. No, it's not ideal. Hopefully in 50 years the Afghans won't use that system either. But for now, I think it's what we've got.
Okay, well, what is the biggest thing that we're failing to do? Because I think, it seems like we're not succeeding, judging by the numbers and the casualty rates of Americans and kind of all. There's something we're not doing. I mean, they've got about as many troops there, I think, as you say they need. They're trying to do counterinsurgency strategy, which you embrace. What is it they're doing wrong? Well,
I would argue that Afghanistan is a couple of different countries. In the north and west, Afghanistan is succeeding. In places like Mazar-e-Sharif, Herat, the area around each of those cities, things are largely like they are in any other developing country. These areas, and in fact Afghanistan as a whole, has a close to 10% GDP growth rate and has had for the last 5 years. It has one of the world's highest growth rates. Granted, it's from a low level, but it's still a success.
And what is the ethnic composition of those areas? Are they all of one persuasion?
No, those are an ethnic mosaic in which Pashtuns are decided minority, maybe 10%. I mean, that's part of the key. Pashtuns are, in a strange way, both the underclass and the ruling class of Afghanistan, in that they have...
They are Karzai's main constituency, right?
That is correct also. But there's...
And they are where the Taliban tend to take root, right?
Yeah, I would just add a bit of finesse there that there are two main tribal groupings of the Pashtuns. They're the Duranis and the Wilzai. Karzai, along with the Afghan royal family, are Durrani. They're hereditary enemies with the Wilzai, who constitute the majority of the Taliban. The Taliban, like the Civil War, was kind of a Wilzai coming to political consciousness and an effort to take back power and to take Kandahar back from the Duranis. The prize in this case isn't Kabul, it's Kandahar. Now, Afghanistan, I think, is heading in the right direction with the exception of the Pashtun Belt. Even parts of the Pashtun Belt are heading in the right direction. The big problem is not anything that's happening in the military context, it's the government. The Karzai government is a disaster. It's become an increasing disaster since 2006. Basically, I think our end goal in Afghanistan is not just to provide a stable, good enough state that isn't a haven for Al-Qaeda. We need to leave Afghanistan as a country that's out of it's working its way out of the culture of poverty. That means a functioning, relatively non-corrupt government down to the local levels, continued good GDP growth, literacy rates that are at least double what they are now. Literacy is very, very low, and the birth rate has got to fall towards a replacement level. Now it's something like 8 live births per women. That's way too high.
So we need to accomplish all of that stuff to succeed?
Well, unless we want 160 million Afghans in another 70 years.
It just seems like we've got our work cut out for us. But before I ask you kind of how we do that, one thing that occurs to me is that, I mean, you say, well, we're succeeding in many of the non-Pashtun areas, and that's fine, but the fact is that the action is in the Pashtun areas, right? That's the test. That's where we have to meet the test, because that's where the Taliban are. That's the part that bleeds over into Pakistan, right?
Well,
in this potentially incendiary way.
That's true, but remember, there was no crisis in 2004, 2005. We're dealing with a very complex mix of factors here, and one, the elephant in the room, of course, is Pakistan, which has a population at least 7 or 8 times the size of Afghanistan. So in a sense, you could get Afghanistan completely right, and it could still founder if Pakistan falls apart.
In fact, can I ask you one crazy? I'm sure it's a crazy question, but it seems to me. I mean, didn't the Taliban start being a problem in Pakistan precisely because we won the Afghanistan war and chased them into Pakistan? Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of people who make the quip that we simply pushed the problem 1,500 miles to the east.
Yeah, we pushed it into a nation that has nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
Exactly. And I mean, so here's the crazy part of the question. I'm sure you'll say it's crazy, but if the worst case scenario is the Taliban, or starting, some sort of, is nuclear weapons winding up in the hands of people whose hands we don't want them in? Could it be that the less than worst scenario would be for the Taliban to come back into Afghanistan and have that nation and at least not have nuclear weapons and get distracted away from Pakistan, or is it your view that invariably, the power in Afghanistan would only aid their ability to disrupt Pakistan?
Well, I mean, I think that's a bit like saying, well, should we just give the mafia, Long Island or Newark or something like that? So.
Well, if the nuclear weapons were in the Midwest and you had to choose between the two, I'd say, keep them in Long Island, yes.
Well,
now, I'm talking about, it's a hypothetical, assuming you accept that the goal of just avoiding the worst case scenario, but the question that even with that premise is probably crazy, is would it stabilize Pakistan to give the Taliban Afghanistan? That's crazy,
of course
right?
Not. Yeah, no, I don't think that makes any sense. I mean, look.
But what's wrong with the argument? I mean, what's wrong if they got chased into Pakistan and started occupying themselves by creating havoc in Pakistan, and if they would actually go back into Afghanistan if they were running Afghanistan? What's wrong with the logic that would actually tend to have a pacifying effect on Pakistan?
Well, for one thing, they came out of Pakistan in the first place. We helped to grow them, as is well known. In the jihad years, we provided funding for the groups. When I was first in Afghanistan in May of 2002, I visited Shibaghan prison, which was in the area controlled by General Dostum in northern Afghanistan, and I wanted to interview some of the prisoners who had been taken in the celebrated incident where Mike Spann was killed. The prisoners were, contrary to popular opinion, were not housed in inhumane conditions. They were quite willing to talk with me, and lo and behold, the obstacle I ran into was that some of them only spoke Urdu. They were from Pakistan. At that point, I barely spoke Dari, but my translator spoke Pashto, and they were all either Pashto or Urdu speakers, and they were either from the border provinces or actually from Pakistan. They had come all the way from Pakistan to do jihad in Afghanistan and got taken prisoner. So, I don't see that giving them, if that were even our decision to make, which it's not, because the people of Afghanistan have that decision to make.
Well, yeah, but the fear is that if we left Afghanistan, the Taliban would sweep back in and take Afghanistan.
No, I think that's a not very well informed view. I don't think any Afghan thinks that either.
What would happen? What would happen if we left Afghanistan, in your view?
If we left Afghanistan, I would imagine one of the things that would happen is there would be a coup against the Karzai government. I don't think Karzai would survive.
That wouldn't necessarily be a terrible thing.
Yeah, and I think that the Afghan National Army would defend its country. The Army is a pretty respected institution, a pretty good institution. There are problems with the Army, but they're not massive problems. They're curable problems that are developmental issues, not structural issues. And very patriotic. I mean, as an Afghan said...
Well, then why don't we just do that? I mean, that doesn't sound like that bad an outcome.
It's not... It would not be the catastrophe, I think, that is envisioned, but it would mean that Afghanistan would have a much, much longer and slower haul in getting to where we want it to be. It's not clear that an Afghanistan that is involved in a low-level, simmering civil war, the parts of the Pashtun belt against the rest of the country, is a very good situation either.
Because that could become a breeding ground for terrorists, or a place, or what?
Yeah, I think it's disruptive of both Pakistan and Afghanistan. People on the border really, they do see each other as and themselves as being either Afghans or Pakistanis, but it's kind of one area, just as people who live in Detroit go to Canada to see a movie, or people in Buffalo, New York. There are borders where people are friends on both sides. They use resources on both sides. Can't expect things to go well in one area if they're going terribly in another. But I mean, more, I'd like to sort of get out of the discussion of the military thing for just an instant, because I think many of the problems which have a military reflection are actually problems of what I call, following Oscar Lewis, Afghanistan's culture of poverty. And that's something we should have been dedicating ourselves to changing. But as Newt Gingrich said in a speech I heard in Washington on September 22nd, the United States had a golden opportunity to change Afghanistan, basically as soon as we invaded, but that would have required admitting that we were changing Afghanistan. And the tragedy of our involvement in that country has been that it's been a collision of two cultures, each of which has lost confidence in its core values. The Afghans have lost confidence in their traditional values because of years of war and the impact of modernity, and we've lost confidence in Western values for reasons that are well known. And I think you had a lot of dilly-dallying and a lot of wasted time because people in the American government weren't willing to say, okay, this is a dysfunctional society. X, Y, and Z have to change. Still within the rubric of Islam, still within the rubric of the Afghan culture, not trying to make them a carbon copy of our culture, but trying to make them a functional version of their own culture.
Okay.
And I could go into detail on that, but part of the other issue is that we've saddled Afghanistan with a terrible constitution, a constitution arguably worse than the Constitution of 1964. And people
because
ask,
it's too centralized. The power is too centralized.
No. It's too centralized.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah.
Yes. And at this point, governors are appointed by the president. Mayors are appointed by the president. There's no way for people to reject them, call them, object to them. The only local elected bodies, the provincial councils, which are elected province-wide, which is the same as our states, have absolutely no designated responsibility or authority. The only people who listen to them are the American Army. Karzai doesn't listen to them. And
I wonder if that was not if that Constitution wasn't constructed in response to the fact that Afghanistan and this seems to be a problem for us, but maybe you'll tell me it's not. Afghanistan historically has not been amenable to centralized control, right? It's always, when it's been stable in a very decentralized way, right?
More or less. I mean, the government never sought to extend its writ to remote mountainous rural areas. Nevertheless, those areas were usually fairly stable because of tribal rule. What I was talking about in the beginning, where I was saying that we should be relying on tribal responsibility to police rural areas. It used to work. Now, that doesn't mean that those tribal areas had anything like what we would wish for them. We're talking about an area where life expectancies were very low, literacy was virtually zero. We're talking about an area where, 1 out of every 4 children doesn't survive beyond its 5th birthday. 1 out of 10 Afghan women would die in childbirth over the course of her life. We're talking about a really terrible level of quality of existence. But it was stable. Now, and we can't go back, even if it were morally acceptable, to say, okay, we'll leave these people all, getting polio and dying of typhoid and so on. Even if that were morally acceptable in the current day, we can't go back to that situation. We have to essentially manage Afghanistan's growth out of a tribal society, and we have to manage it very quickly so that it doesn't become a demographic time bomb. That's my view. I also think, I want to just talk about democracy for another minute, because only democracy will make people ready for democracy. It is true that Afghans right now are not, quote, ready for democracy in the sense that people in, New York and New Jersey are. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, even in their most private choices like voting, individuals have internalized group norms. They unconsciously and consciously go with a consensus. They always try to figure out what everyone else is doing. It's not that you will figure out, okay, which candidate approximates my vision or my values or my religion. It's more like who's going to be popular with the rest of my family or the rest of my tribe. It's kind of demeaning to have voted for a loser. People have internalized the tribal, consensual nature of decision-making. It's very hard for a Westerner to grasp, but it has to do with the nature of the self in Afghanistan. It's really traditional, completely family and group-centered society. The individual is very sketchy compared to an individual in the United States.
And you think this needs to change?
I think it is changing slowly. It has to change in order for Afghanistan to be a stable country. You can't have 1 or 2 countries in the world that are living in the 15th century while everyone else is living in the current time. It's not going to work. Those areas will become unstable. That's just how it is. I think you could have those differences in 1920, but I don't think you can have them now. We're seeing that even in other areas like New Guinea, like certain areas in Indonesia that are very, very backwards. They become havens for groups that are destabilizing.
I would guess that maybe sometimes what's destabilizing is just the fact of change, the fact of transition, and you're almost suggesting that we hasten the transition, I think.
Yeah, there's no way back. I definitely think we have to hasten the transition while drawing upon the strong points of that society. And the strong point in Afghan society is the cohesion of the family and a sense of honor and a sense of justice centered around that. And we can draw upon that. No one says we have to do things in the stupidest way possible. But, for example, in Afghanistan, everyone views themselves as a member of a family, but no one views him or herself as a member of a society. And, for example, no one wants to stand in line like everyone else. Everyone wants to jump the queue. Everyone throws his or her trash out the car window because no one thinks about the implications of generalizing that behavior. No one understands the categorical imperative that if everyone did it, it would be a terrible situation.
I guess, can I tell you the sort of skepticism that's welling up within me as you speak? It just you're calling for a really thoroughgoing transformation of the society. It's a really, I mean, I thought of this earlier when you were saying, you know, got to raise the literacy rate, lower the birth rate. You're talking about major transformations of norms, and it sounds like you're saying if they're kind of left to their own devices, this will happen in a disruptive, counterproductive way. The transition to modernity will happen in a really unfortunate way. And I guess the alternative is for American, troops and other Americans to be pretty closely involved in fostering and overseeing the change. And it just... what I wonder is, you know, is there anything in recent history that gives us hope to think, A, we would succeed, you know, a social engineering challenge on that scale, B, isn't it the case that the presence of American troops, which, you know, that then we get blamed for the inevitable disruption and unpleasantness associated with this sort of transformation? I mean... you probably heard this before, right? I mean,
sure, but first of all, I'm not advocating more troops. I'm advocating fewer troops and a lighter footprint.
Well, right, but there are a lot there already, and you're talking about but you are talking about an American presence with a more comprehensive agenda, in a certain sense, more comprehensively intrusive agenda than probably is currently the case, right?
Not really, no. I mean, I'm talking about using the same number of people to do many of the same things we have been doing in a more intelligent manner. And I could get really specific. I mean, going down to...
Well, just one example of something that's being done stupidly right now that should be done in another way would be helpful.
Well, sure. I mean, but I also want to address the issue that you just said of whether societies can be changed in this way, because obviously Japan and Germany are great examples of societies that were changed in constructive ways after World War II.
After complete and abject defeat in a period of, you know, utter, you know, capitulation, and in a very different age when, you know, for example, I mean, I know in your writing you've sometimes touted as good news the proliferation of cell phones in Afghanistan. Well, arguably, this decentralization of information technology and the way it empowers groups in a decentralized way is the enemy of anybody who wants to come in and do top-down change. We didn't have to contend with that in Japan or Germany, that degree of empowerment of ordinary citizens. So I would say Japan and Germany are really different cases, A. And B, they were both much more modern societies relative to that time, right, than Afghanistan is relative to this time.
That is true. However, if you could also look at social changes in the United States. I mean, no one would have dreamed 40 years ago, and I'm not going to talk about like having a black president. I'm going to talk about the fact that very few people smoke anymore.
Sure, but that wasn't imposed on us by a foreign government. Lots of things happen organically and rapidly in a modern society. But I'm saying, you know, is there a precedent for an outside power as comprehensively reforming a society that is all comparable to this?
Yes, there is. It's called Afghanistan, and it was changed immensely by the Arab armies that invaded and brought Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries.
Well, I really would question whether the context of the 7th and 8th centuries were comparable to the context we find ourselves in today.
Well, they brought a religion, a culture. They brought literacy in some cases. They brought some good things. They brought some bad things. They killed a lot of people, but they brought a more organized society to Afghanistan at that point.
But I think you'll agree we can't afford to kill as many people as they killed proportionally. And anyway, sorry, go. I'm skeptical, but go ahead with the other.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, for instance, one of the good things we've been doing is PRTs, provincial reconstruction teams. Recently, they started doing agricultural provincial reconstruction teams, which bring like 15 American reserve soldiers or airmen or naval officers who are farmers or have something to do with agricultural business in the United States, to teach Afghans in rural areas better techniques of livestock raising, of crop storage, etc. That's a good idea. It's just beginning. It needs to be expanded. Something that we've been doing is having American advisors in the ministries in Kabul. Commander Dave Adams, who was the provincial reconstruction team head in Khost province in '07, had a very good idea to extend that all the way down to the local level in the judicial system. You have a lot of judges who are barely literate. Many of them are also barely honest. Give each one of them a young American European advisor, not to do anything super complicated, but to make sure that they evolve a system, which they don't have now, where similar cases are decided in similar ways. There's absolutely no sense that if two people provide a judge with the same information about their case to plaintiffs, that they will get the same verdict. Part of that is because this is a very uneducated society. Part of it is tradition. Part of it is corruption. That all needs to change. I mean, until people can rely on the judicial system, they will turn either to tribal justice or to the Taliban courts, which provide a consistent and predictable system of justice. That's something we can do. I would also say the problem in Afghanistan now is not school building, it's who's teaching in those schools. Every person and their cousin now seems to have a charity in the United States to build schools in Afghanistan. Well, the American Army has done more school building than anyone else. They built over 80 schools just in Khost, for example. That's great, but those schools are being taught by people with a less than 6th grade education in many cases. That's a huge problem. The second big problem is that there are very, very few women teachers outside of the cities. Yes, there are in Mazar-i-Sharif. Yes, there are in Kabul. Yes, there are even in Khost City. In the rural areas, 0 female teachers. Why is that a problem? Because most families won't let their girls go to school to be taught by a male teacher. They need a female teacher to feel comfortable sending the girls to school. So it's a self-defeating cycle. No schools for girls, therefore no female teachers, therefore...
But are there also a lot of locals, even in towns not infiltrated by Taliban, who disapprove of girls going to school in the first place?
Yes, there are in the Pashtun area. It depends very much on the tribe, on the area.
So the Pashtun are the Pashtun more socially conservative than the other ethnicities in general?
I would say you could even use the word backward, yes. You will find almost nobody opposed to primary girls' schools in the north. And even in, for example, in Ghazni province, about 50% of the population is Hazara, about 50% are Pashtun. In the Pashtun areas, school attendance is 40%. In the Hazara areas, school attendance is 90%. No other difference. People make their living in the same way. They're all poor. They're all about the same level of literacy, and let's say, the people who are 30, 40, 50. But the kids in the Hazara areas are all going to be literate, and the kids in the Pashtun areas are not. So it is the culture. I've had people outright tell me, no, we won't send our girls to school. Now, the first reason given is the absence of a female teacher. Then if you probe a bit, it becomes that the walk to school is an issue because they don't want their girls either seen by men walking to school, because they're not supposed to be outside the family compound, or they're afraid the girls will be kidnapped or raped if they are outside the family compound of school. I mean, that's more of an issue for older girls, but in some areas it's an issue even for 6-year-olds. So you have a very messed up culture, an area where literally, I cannot tell you how primitive it is. Literally until the American Army began building infrastructure there, the situation was really like it was in the year 800. No electricity, no literacy. I've been to numerous villages where I've asked, okay, can I talk to a literate person? Who are the literate people in this village? And I'll get a list of 5 names in a village of 2,000 people.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd say that's the 8th century. That's the early 20th century in parts of America, but...
no, that's not true. I mean,
Oh, there were towns in America with no literate people at the turn of the century, I think, in 1900?
No, I don't believe that's true. In 18... Yeah, not hardly even in 1800. Literacy was very high, I mean, as it was even in the British countryside. I mean, we may be talking about pretty basic literacy, but that's exactly what I'm talking about in Afghanistan. I mean, I'm talking about people...
There were relatives of mine who in 1900 were illiterate, I know, but maybe they were the exception. They were out on the farm.
Really? They were in the United States and they were native-born Americans?
Yeah, that's my impression.
I will try to look that up. I'm very curious. But I don't believe that. In fact, I'm almost certain that's not the case because I know something. What I will tell you, and here's going back to what you said earlier, Bob. An example of social change. Look at Puerto Rico. Okay, Oscar Lewis wrote a book called La Vida, examining a slum called La Esmeralda outside San Juan, Puerto Rico, in the early 1960s. He compared the situation he found in the early 60s with the 1940s. And in the 1940s, Puerto Rico had about 30% literacy. It was 90% by the early 60s. Mm-hmm. They still had what we would call the culture of poverty following him. That was the term he used. But things were slowly getting better. Afghanistan now is somewhat similar to Puerto Rico in 1960, even down to GDP, with about $800 per person. GDP, tiny percentage of people made more than $5,000 a year, about the same percent, and thus qualified as the upper class. Very low levels of involvement in the community, very low levels of political participation, and yet that situation has changed a great deal today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, did you say, can you cite one thing that you think is now being done just the wrong way and should be done differently?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the absence of, as I was saying, the fact that we've largely left the justice system to fend for itself. I mean, there's something called the Rule of Law program. They do chain judges a couple times a year. They invite people to Kabul for, a training program that lasts a week or something, but there's no day-to-day monitoring of what's going on in the judicial system. We should get the Afghan police out of the districts. We should also, we need to hold Afghans more accountable. And this gets back to our lack of cultural confidence and theirs. The best way to encourage self-respect on the part of Afghans is to cultivate a strong sense of responsibility and morality. And they have that. Basically, there's a situation now where if someone gets blown up by an IED, an improvised explosive device, outside an Afghan village, the Americans will complain. There'll be a tribal shura, and the leaders will often say something like, well, I mean, we can't stand up to the bad guys because we're afraid, and it's really not our responsibility. It's really the responsibility of the tribe that provided these insurgents, blah, 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 blah. No one is willing to stand up and say the buck stops here. We are going to mete out punishment, which is what would have happened in 1920 or 1930. We need
you mean Americans should say that, or
the Afghans have to say that.
Well, yeah, but how do you make them say it?
Well, there are a number of ways. I mean, considering that we're essentially running that part of the country, there are ways. You say, you govern yourselves, but forever. I mean, I've suggested to people, tell the local leaders, all right, you've got $1 million coming your way in development money. Every time an IED goes off in your area, we're taking $100,000 off that budget. So you keep the situation clean, you get your $1 million. 5 IEDs, you get 500,000. 10 IEDs, you get nothing. Choice is yours. This is our money, not your money. You don't have any right to it. We're choosing to give you this money. So
okay, that sounds like it might work. Can I? One thing I mean, we're running short on time, but one thing I'm wondering is there any part of the Pashtun Belt where an appreciable stretch, tens of square miles involving hundreds of thousands of people or something, where counterinsurgency has succeeded in restoring order to a place where it had been lost? I mean, in other words, in the Pashtun Belt, has the doctrine recently succeeded even in a kind of a microcosm, a kind of microscopic way?
Well, I saw some good stuff going on in Holst in 2007, 2008. Unfortunately, it kind of went backward in, late 2008, 2009.
For discernible reasons, or
yeah, it was a change of command, different people. Bad PRT commander, who no one liked, from the maneuver command to the Afghans themselves. An okay but not outstanding maneuver commander, who liked to go out on night patrols with his men. Very brave guy, but neglected the work of counterinsurgency. Again and again, I keep coming back to that it's a perceptual reorientation. It's very, very hard. It's hard for you. It's hard for me. It's harder for soldiers to get out of the mindset that their business is chasing the enemy. Their business is not chasing the enemy. Business is providing something positive for people to have loyalty to.
Sure, and this is a very recent and radical reorientation of the military mission. I mean, counterinsurgency, because of the Iraq experience, has just suddenly, and this is another thing that worries me, is like, how many people do we have who we are confident are trained to do it well? I mean, you just pointed out that there was a commander who apparently wasn't. And what rank was that, by the way, the guy who you said was just terrible?
Well, no, there was a person who was just terrible who was a PRT commander.
And that's what rank?
That's usually a Navy or Air Force person. It was actually a female, and
that's like an officer, right? A mid-level officer.
No, it's the equivalent of lieutenant colonel.
Okay, so mid-level to high officer. Okay, I mean, I guess that's one thing is that it's so it's just it's a tough thing, very dependent on not just the training in a way, but kind of the intuitive skills, right? Of it depends on choosing the people who have a really subtle skill set, I would think.
Yeah, it's very dependent on individuals, but the military is a people business. That's it is unfortunate, but it's very true. It's even doubly true in the societies which are likely to have insurgencies, which are societies where human relations counts for a great deal. An American can be in a business situation or a military situation, or a governmental situation. They will deal with someone they have to deal with, even if they don't like him personally. They will deal with him in what we call a professional manner, respecting his or her professional position. And they may never want to have a lunch with that person, but they can transact business with them, for years. That's much harder to do in a place like Afghanistan. And Afghans are incredibly attuned to social cues. Basically, in the crucial years from like 0 to 5, when American kids are learning all kinds of stuff, when they're being read to, they're learning to read, they're playing games, they're playing sports, they're being taken to museums and zoos and this and that. Afghan kids are sitting at home, silent, watching their elders, and they're learning a lot. They may not be learning stuff that's useful for them in building a modern society, but they sure come out of that with great social skills.
Well, right, and in a way they're learning something that's not conducive to a modern society, which is that it's all about personal interaction. I mean, part of a modern society, and I'm not very good at this myself, but is separating your professional relationship from your personal feelings and about someone, including the degree of personal respect they seem to be giving you and so on. And I'm guessing that in traditional societies in general, people have trouble forging relationships that just transcend all those personal cues, right?
You're absolutely right. I mean, that's absolutely right. And if they like you, Afghans will go out of their way for you, even if they don't have to.
And that's what I mean is when you've got to be picking captains and lieutenants and lieutenant colonels who are well liked by people in this culture they've never been in, that's tough. That's tough. And they don't speak the language, and it's tough.
Yeah, but it's our Army are really good at that, and there's an extensive body of literature going all the way back to the late 50s. I mean, our war colleges were teaching counterinsurgency in the 60s. I've been writing and studying a lot about this myself, and basically there are ways of evaluating officers which can pick the ones who will be good to lead a counterinsurgency and put the other ones in other jobs. I mean, counterinsurgency isn't 100% of what our Army does either. Charismatic, personable officers will probably always do better, but they're especially needed in a place like Afghanistan. Right.
And it's a tough road to hoe. Let me so we're about to run out of time. I'm going to give you one more burst of time to just say anything you think needs saying hasn't been said. Let me finish the first before I do that. Just cap the inquiry I started this little tangent off with, which is is there any place in the Pashtun Belt where counterinsurgency has succeeded in an enduring way? I guess my thinking about the surge is, even if they're right, and it would take 60,000 additional troops or something to make counterinsurgency work in all of Afghanistan, before we do that, it seems to me we must have enough troops in principle to show that it can work on a smaller scale in a challenging area like the Pashtun Belt. So I'd like to see it, I'd like to see that little demo, before we send a whole bunch of more troops over there.
Well, but that demo has, has been taking place. I don't know.
Well, yeah, but has it worked enduringly in any appreciable stretch of Pashtun terrain? That is, a disorderly area reclaimed enduringly by counterinsurgency strategy, a disorderly area of some size, of some scale.
Well, again, I would say that the American Army itself considered Host its success. It was not an enduring success. There is a different unit there now. They're supposedly doing good things. I'm going to go see that in November. They got there in late August, maybe too early to see. But, unfortunately, that's kind of, without institutions, without Afghan government institutions that don't exist yet, it's very hard to remove the personality-dependent factor here. And, it's like, to use a military analogy, we're building the airplane while we're flying it.
Right. That is not an inspiring analogy, I've got to say.
It's tough, but it's a fight we can't lose. I agree with McChrystal on that.
That's the part I'm not, I'm not convinced that losing it, in other words, losing Afghanistan is worse than the outcome of failing on a larger scale to win it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But let me just, as I said, we're running near the end of time. Why don't you go ahead and take a few minutes to say anything you wanted to say and have failed to say or that you think needs saying?
Well, a couple of things. I would say that I often hear the questions, are Afghans ready for democracy? I would argue that democracy changes people. It changes the way they think. It changes the way they behave. I think that's been neglected. Maybe I'm making a neocon argument, but I think it's an argument that needs to be made. Voting helps to create a private mental space, a space that's big enough for citizenship. And that's why it becomes a habit, it becomes addictive, and eventually people find it worth dying for, as they have in Iran recently. Eventually it will sink into Afghans that voting is a decision they have to make by themselves. Once they're used to making that choice on an individual basis and a private basis, they may start to make other life choices that way. What work do I do? Do I want to really go into the same profession that my father and my grandfather did? Who shall I marry? Do I really want to marry the girl that my mom picked out for me? Faced with definite choices, you may emerge from the kind of cloud of vague notions and superstitions that you live in. One of the terribly frustrating things in Afghanistan now is that most Afghans seem to exist in a kind of fog. If you even ask a college-educated person, okay, how far is such and such a village from here? The answer is almost inevitably very far, or it is not far, rather than 20 kilometers or a 40-minute drive or whatever. People don't know how to keep or think about statistics. I get a lot of blank looks if I ask a governor or some ministers in Afghanistan, what % of people in such and such an area do such and such? The idea of keeping statistics is very connected with being modern, and we need people to go in that direction. So it's building the airplane while you're flying it. You're trying to improve literacy, to bring democracy, to get people making private individual choices, to get them to think for themselves, to get them to think in specific terms, to get out of the fog.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I hope it works. If we take as ambitious a path as you're advocating.
Yeah, I hope so too.
And thanks for sharing your vast database. You've really done your homework, including a lot of primary research, which is hard to come by. I mean, in other words, firsthand witnessing of stuff over there. So I hope maybe you'll come back sometime as your database grows and check in.
That'd be wonderful. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, and good luck in your travels in Afghanistan in November.
Thanks so much, and have a great fall.
Okay, you too.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.